Welcome to Food for Thought. Today I have amazing guests with me, Eddie Zapata and Rogério Marques. Rogério has a YouTube channel, the whole project discussing philosophy, also a Discord called the Agora. And Eddie, um, he's a writer. He has a fascinating book on Amazon called The West is the Light. The link is in the description. Later, we will be joined by Michael Lopiano. And yeah, we are talking about the direction of Europe's culture in modern times. Roger, could you tell me a little bit about your project?
Sure. So I realized that in my career, technical knowledge and competence is not the entire thing. We also need to develop other faculties, and one of these faculties is related to self-awareness, emotional intelligence, etc. It led me to leadership literacy with some courses I took as well. And this course on leadership led me smack dab into Marcus Aurelius's writings, which was basically my gate to the entrance into the entire world of philosophy. So this happened 3 years ago, and since then I've been listening to philosophy audiobooks, especially, but also in writing as well, looking at the entire Western canon, Plato, Aristotle, the other writings depicting Socrates, fragments from these Ionian and Magna Grecian philosophers. And then also I went on a journey through other continents, philosophy like India, China, Japan, Persia, etc. And all this is an ongoing project. Of course, by doing this voyage of the mind, so to speak, inevitably I'm inspired to share my thoughts and share my writings, which I do on Twitter especially, on a daily basis, very regularly, because I also delve into classics, philosophy, mythology, etc. on a daily basis. And I'm also writing. I also put together writing in the form of books. One is a notebook that kind of structures philosophical thoughts. That's the aspiration, at least. And another one is a book on aphorisms that I put together throughout these past 3 years. I also have the YouTube channel where I often collaborate with others, either through podcasts or even through fully fledged videos with narration and showing visuals, etc., to instruct people on, for instance, the thought of Aristotle about what came first, the chicken or the egg, the prime mover kind of thing, or Taoism, and many others to come. And so, well, this is a work in progress. There is much to do if we want to contribute to our culture, both on a local and a global scale. And so I look forward to the challenges that the future holds, to continue doing this, to breathe new light into the classics and bring them into the limelight of our contemporary lives.
Wow. One question. Where can we find your book of aphorisms?
Okay, so it's on Amazon and
Oh.
both in ebook and paperback. It's called To the Self, because basically it originated in a series of tweets that I would do as notes to myself. A bit taking inspiration from Marcus Aurelius's way of doing his notes to himself as well. And then after I had a bunch of material, I would use the Twitter search to the beginning of these tweets, all with the note to self, and I edited, put them together into a book of aphorisms, similar to what Marcus Aurelius's meditations look like, and also some of Nietzsche's books as well.
Eddie, your book. We did the whole food for thought about it, which is still on YouTube. Guys, check it out. Fascinating conversation. Can you please summarize it again, just for people who didn't see? Spoiler alert.
Well, following up on what Roger just said, in a way, my book is a fictionalized account of all these values that Roger just talked about. But the story itself is as follows. There's a young American boy, 12 years old. He's sitting on his bed in his suburban American household reading a book. The book is called The Light of Western Civilization. It's a gift from his grandfather. As he reads as he looks at the images in the pages, his eyes get sleepy and he falls asleep. He opens his eyes and there's a mysterious Scotsman named Alistair in his room. And Alistair invites Clark on a journey of European history and culture through the means of the book. So the book becomes like a portal, a transportation device through history. And the first place they visit is Stonehenge, and afterwards they go to Spain and visit the cave paintings. They go to the Black Forest in Germany. They go to Athens, and that's just volume 1. Volume 2 will pick up where volume 1 left off. I hope to transport him to Republic Rome. And along the way, he's not just learning history, he's also growing. He expressed to his instructors that he has always felt like men in his age, meaning our contemporary age, are not very manlike anymore. They seem to have forgotten what that means. So as he's talking to Socrates and Achilles, because some of the figures are mythological, he's also training. They're training the boy in fighting, in boxing, in swordplay, in outdoor survival skills. So he's being transformed bodily as he is mentally and intellectually. So that's The West is the Light.
It's on Amazon. The link is below. Okay, let's get to the subject. Rogério, you come from South Africa, and you with your parents moved to Europe. What was your impression of Europe, even as a child?
Okay, so I moved from Johannesburg, a huge metropolis in South Africa, bustling with activity and economically prosperous at the beginning of the 90s at the time. And I visited, I basically landed in a small village in also early 90s Portugal, which was a huge contrast because Portugal was only 20 years after recovering from a revolution in which Portugal stopped being a dictatorship, and Portugal was only just barely opening up to other Western countries. One example of this was the introduction finally of Coca-Cola and other products very disseminated and commonly found in what we call Western countries as well, and the world at large even. But this country, Portugal, was under the iron fist of a dictatorship that closed it off from other countries in an extreme form of economic protectivism, and also some totalitarianism, because individual freedoms, at least in mainland Portugal, were suppressed. While my parents experienced colonial Portugal in Mozambique, then they moved to South Africa when the quite violent and abrupt decolonization occurred after the revolution in '74. 10 years later, after the revolution, I was born in '84 in South Africa, and in '93 I find myself in Portugal, and so I see that people were much simpler in terms of their culture. They didn't have much exposure to the complexities of the psyche of and culture and pop culture of the full-fledged Anglo-Western world yet. For instance, I remember boys and girls would dress really simply without much show off and whatnot. But this changed in the rest of the 90s and the noughties, which I found really a really interesting experience in my point of view, in my personal point of view. And well, let's leave it at that.
Was there a culture shock for you? Something like completely stunningly different from what you were used to in South Africa, Rogério?
Yeah, for sure. In South Africa, there were a bunch of pop culture icons and shows on TV. Cinema was all the rage. I remember seeing Jurassic Park and being terrified of the T-Rex and whatnot. But here in Portugal, things were still way simpler. It's also my perspective is also limited by my transition to a small place in Portugal. But things were starting to open up here, but still there was this culture shock because we had so much options in terms of entertainment in South Africa. I was basically the first to bring a video game console to our village here in Portugal, a Mega Drive or Genesis, and after that I kind of by introducing the possibility and the context, the even concept of video games, other kids also would get video game consoles. I wonder maybe if I hadn't arrived here, I wouldn't have kind of inspired this change locally, basically. But other than that, I was awed when I started to visit cultural heritage here in Portugal, because in contrast with South Africa, which literally has nothing more than 100 years old standing in terms of architecture, here we have churches, castles, cathedrals. We have old Roman ruins and whatnot. So there's so much here to visit that you can just spend many months going up and down the country, visiting all this heritage that's here. And fortunately, nothing terrible happened to it, like what happened to, for instance, Germany during World War II, where a lot of architectural heritage was lost. And here in Portugal, fortunately, things weren't so lost in that sense. Thus, we have so much to offer here to visit. That stood out to me as well. But also, people here weren't so stressed out, and so they didn't kind of create in their minds so many problems as a more, so to speak, materially prosperous place was generating, which maybe it's kind of like innate wisdom of Europe in a sense, that people are kind of grounded to simpler and more concise ways of thinking, instead of just wondering stuff and creating problems out of thin air, unnecessarily complicating our lives, as might happen in very prosperous societies.
Okay. Eddie, when did you arrive to Europe, and what was your first impression?
I guess you could say intellectually, I arrived there first. When I was a kid, I discovered the Western canon, and that was my first knowledge that there was this civilization called European culture. I read Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Cervantes. I read Plutarch, his histories of the Greek of the Roman Greek and Roman leaders. So anyway, when I finally physically set foot in Europe, I was about 23 years old. I was a U.S. Marine stationed in Morocco, in Rabat, and I took 2 weeks off of leave. And my first week I spent in Spain, and my second week in the UK. And I remember a huge feeling of exhilaration. I couldn't wait to get there. because again, I'd hyped it up in my mind so much. Prior to that, in Morocco, I was part of an expat community which involved Brits and French people and several Europeans, and I was so I at first that was they were my first exposure, and I remember being impressed by how witty, how sophisticated they were compared to us, obnoxious Americans. And so I couldn't wait to go to the motherland. And Madrid was wonderful. This was in 1997. It's probably quite different now. I had paella for the first time. The Spaniards were wonderful. Their version of Spanish was different than my Latin American Spanish, and that was part of the charm too. I visited Toledo and Cordoba, these Middle Eastern, not Middle Eastern, medieval cities. One of them is the center of sword making in the Middle Ages, and I bought myself a sword like a complete tourist. So I love Spain. Then I spent 5 days in London. I went to what's their Broadway district called? It's where all the theaters are. Anyway, I remember seeing Jesus Christ Superstar at the Lyceum Theater there. And London was impressive, although it was a big city. It was not as English as I would have wanted because I want to visit the people who are from that country. But 2 days of the 7 days in the UK, I went to a tiny little village outside of Edinburgh, Scotland, and that was wonderful. I stayed with a friend on her family's property, woke up and she made breakfast, and there was the sound of sheep and various animals in the background. We went to a Scottish castle, my first castle in my life, except for Spain, I guess, the week before. So yeah, overall, it was wonderful. I loved Europe. I still do.
Eddie, was there a culture shock comparing US and European cities that you visited?
No, no. I think I, I think I was educated enough to know what I was getting into, and nothing really came out at me. Since I visited in '97, I've been to Europe several times. So let me add to the list. In addition to Spain and England and Scotland, I've also been to Ireland now, Greece, uh, Italy, and briefly one day in Amsterdam. So I'll include the Netherlands. Each country has its own flavor. Uh, I will say it's not a culture shock per se, but each one of the countries I visited had their own distinct, beautiful culture. But the only time I detected, well, no, that's not true. Twice in my travels, I detected what you might say was not culture shock, but a sense of negativity. And one was in Greece, and it wasn't one particular thing. I think it was just we all know the Greeks have had an economic issue for a long, long time, and I think that has maybe gotten into their DNA. There's just a kind of a lack of this. This is just one person's opinion, okay? They just seemed maybe they're exhausted with seeing tourists too. They just didn't they missed the spark that I saw among the Italians when I went to Italy afterwards. So that was Greece. And then I went to Northern Ireland in 2019. And again, we all know Northern Ireland has a certain history, and that's real. It's palpable there. Well, I went into one bar and I looked around. It was all Ireland this and Catholic that and Guinness this and well, Guinness, that's a bad example. That was a Protestant. Arthur Guinness was Protestant. But and then you go to another pub and it's all Queen Elizabeth because she was alive at the time. And it was such a strange, it was like this apartheid that even though the shooting has stopped, the feelings are still there and they're very strong. And so by the time I traveled from one side of Northern Ireland to the other to Belfast, I'm like, all right, I'm ready to go back down to the Republic. This is too, I'm glad I came here, but this isn't a very friendly place. So that's my version of culture shock.
I guess the impression
Mhm.
that the people gave. I kind of think there is a common trope here um, uh, with my experience. Idea that when I first arrived to Poland,
Mhm.
uh, I did not experience the culture shock. Everybody seemed like human. But then the moment I dived into some unexpected behaviors, like a
Mhm.
story would be somebody asked me to steal a painting from a wall in Poland. there was a culture shock. I was like, for me, it was unthinkable to steal something. I'm not claiming all Polish people steal. I'm not doing that. We will mention everybody today. We have Michael with us from a 21st Century Renaissance.
Hey.
Can you tell all of us a little bit about your project, 21st Century Renaissance?
Sure, sure. Well, I did my PhD in the study of the Renaissance. I've been very much interested in this period and in the concept of Renaissance from an individual perspective, or I should say an individual psychological perspective, and from the cultural perspective. I'm very interested in particular about the connections between the individual psychology and in culture, and sort of how those things relate and how they might mirror one another, sort of at different orders of magnitude. That's something that's intrigued me for a while. But in particular, I've been interested in the capital R Renaissance, and in this propensity, certainly in Western historiography or Western scholarship, to talk about periods of Renaissance. It's quite possible that this is something that in Western society is particularly capable or primed to notice, given that resurrection, rebirth, and being raised from the dead are central parts of Western religion through Christianity and therefore culture. 21st century Renaissance is not only about looking at the historic Renaissance, but also in comparing the historic Renaissance to what is going on in world culture today, but sort of looking at the West, given that I'm from the United States, and the capital R Renaissance is from the historic European context. Whether or where, perhaps I should say, that society is today within maybe one of these cycles or epicycles of cultural decay and rebirth, and perhaps what are the elements of contemporary society today that may have some parallels with the historic Renaissance, and what we can potentially learn from that. So by inviting guests on who I think are participating in that sort of activity, such as the three of you here, in terms of, say, authorship, both Rogério and Eddie have been hard at work in authoring publications that are operable within that domain. And of course, all of you are participating in this new, exciting, exponentially more interconnected medium of podcasts, of connecting online, of social media, which certainly revolutions in communication are very much a part of historic renaissances and the historic European Renaissance with a capital R. So that's the project, right? We try to get an episode, try to average a new episode every 2 weeks or so, as travel and time allows. So yeah, that's the project.
Thank you. So you come from the US and you arrived to Europe. What was your first impression? And you lived here for a while, right?
Yes. I've lived in, probably, if you took all the time together, a lot of it early on was mostly just summers. I've probably lived an aggregate of maybe about a year of time in various places in Italy. I lived a summer in Austria, and together now probably closer to 4 or 5 years of time total in Poland. So my impression, first and foremost, there is a much greater appreciation for beauty, something that Eddie and I have talked about recently. There's a much greater appreciation for beauty. This is a value, I would say, in European society even today, that I would say is absent from a lot of from the daily life of Americans. Actually, it was very interesting. I just got back from Massachusetts and Rhode Island with my family. I'm in the United States right now, actually visiting my parents, and we spent some time at the late 19th century Gilded Age mansions in Newport, Rhode Island. And in particular, we went to see the chief mansion of the Vanderbilt family, which is called the Breakers. and it's developed in this characteristic Italian, Franco-Italian, French late Baroque and high Italian Renaissance style kind of mixed together in terms of its design and its interior decoration. And there is just an attention. It stands out. It's definitely a piece of Europe that's been transposed. It doesn't fit, let's say, in the typical, zone of many windowed boxes that characterizes most American cities. On the way back, actually, from Newport, I passed the U.S. Naval War College, and you can see it from the bridge going across is that the Penobscot Bay? I'm not sure exactly which it is. But in any case, you can see the U.S. Naval War College, and you can see the historic 19th century Naval War College, which is in this traditional sort of late Georgian, early 19th century style, has a definite characteristic to it. It has a definite aesthetic to it. And then you see maybe the more modern expansion of the U.S. Naval War College, which is a bunch of boxes, behind it. So, I mean, there is some of that, I would say, in Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. You can see in Italy some of the fascist architecture takes this characteristic where there is a complete eschewing of beauty as a value. It's not a socialist value. It's not a futurist value. It's not a modernist value. Beauty. But this is something that has been so valued in European culture for so long that you can't simply erase it with a few decades or even a century of modernism. So I feel a sense of peace in particular. Just sort of, I don't know. I don't feel like I need to be entertained, right? I think it's a major part of American culture, especially at least growing up in Connecticut and the Northeast, being around New York. There's this, what you're supposed to do in your free time is be entertained. Leisure means taking your time and exchanging it for some sort of stimulation. Yeah. And in the sense of, in I guess American cities, that really is what you do. Why would you go for a walk in, the Bronx, something like that? Why would you do that? But it's very different living in Poland, living in Rome, in Vienna. Yeah, if you're tired, if it's time to take a break, like what are you gonna do? You just go for a walk, and you can do it for hours. And at the end, you're like, okay, I'm removed from the anxieties of my day. Like I feel fulfilled in a certain way. I did something valuable with my time. I observed all of this combined natural beauty and sort of aesthetically minded sort of space development. That's something that I think is very sorely lacking from my experience of growing up in the U.S. in most places. Did that answer your question? Did I express that clearly?
Yeah, plenty. Did you experience culture shock?
Culture shock. I would say not so much. Because, well, like these two gentlemen here, I've spent a good bit of my time studying traditional European culture. So, reading these great books, being beholden to these works of art. My parents very often, right? They grew up with these older European values. Their parents maintain these values. Even though they're Americans, right? Even though they might not have the real full depth of a classical education, I would say, right? My parents are older. My parents were both in their 40s when I was born, and so they were born in the 1950s, early 1950s. So to a certain right, and then their parents were born, first few years of the first decade or so of the second decade of the 20th century, and had emigrated or were children. They were very, very young children when they emigrated. So those values, at least in my family, were still kind of around. Maybe again, maybe not as profound or present to a depth that maybe others with a deeper classical education may have had, but I would say in many ways I felt better integrated immediately into European society than I in any sense in all of these different societies in Austria, in Italy, in Poland. And you know, people were always surprised to learn that I was American. They expected me to be kind of touristy, not really flamboyant, but sort of just loud, extremely outgoing, sort of looking at everything like it was a theme park. And yeah, sure enough, maybe I see Eddie laughing. I wonder to what degree he's had an experience maybe looking or seeing other Americans in Europe just kind of living as though the entire place is Disney World. Um, yeah, that's innate. And sure enough, for all the time I've spent, you really can pick out the Americans, and to a certain extent Brits, based on the degree to which they treat this city in some part of the world, which is, it's a fully working city that's a part of a bunch of people's everyday lives, like it's a theme park, So, um, yeah, I would not say that I experienced culture shock in maybe the way that some others do.
Eddie, do you relate to
I mean,
the theme park?
yes, I do. I'm not in my life. Obviously, I don't act that way. But when I go overseas to Europe or anywhere else, this is terrible. Whenever if I hear an American accent, I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Get away from me. And if it's unavoidable, I'll turn to my friends. I'm like, okay, those are Americans. As you can see, I'm different. But I was laughing because we do have that characteristic. It's kind of flamboyant, a little childish, adolescent. But you mentioned the Brits, and I wonder if we got it from the Brits because I mean, we are children of Britain in a way. I'm
Yeah, yeah,
serious.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm serious. There's something in the English character that makes them different from other Europeans, and since we are the child of England, I think that may be one thing that we inherited from the sense of the world's our plaything.
Yeah, well, that was, I mean, I know, in the 16th, 17th century, I mean, the perspective of Brits among continental Europeans was like, oh my gosh, who are these weird backwater people with this weird, obscure language? It's interesting, like to look at, there's a Pope, Pope Pius II, before he was Pope, Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini in the 15th century, was an emissary for the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand Frederick III. And he spent several years in Britain, and he was like, you wouldn't believe these people in this place, this land of Britannia, Caledonia. They're, especially the Caledonian women. Speaking of Scottish women, he's like, they have utterly no shame, and they'll just walk up to you and speak their minds, and invite you to go for a private stroll or something like that. They'd just as sooner kiss you as shake your hand, something like that. So this is sort of this idea that, like, whoa, like these Brits, they're not quite the same as us. Yeah.
Okay, let's move to next part of the conversation. In your opinions, what drives European culture forward? Let's start with you, Rogério.
So Europe has a cultural background that is really centuries or millennia old. We have a lot to where to draw from if we know where to look. For Portugal, peculiarly, as I would mention, we have this culturally ingrained character of improvising versus the unexpected, which happened in the massive earthquake of 1775, if the year is correct, where we reacted in really interesting ways at the time. And I think it's part of our cultural DNA, this concept of desenrascanço, as we say it here in Portugal, which it tackles modern problems like that of startups and innovation in information technologies arena in remarkable ways. So basically, I think that we can both go to our treasure trove of ancient and medieval values, repurpose them and use them to counter current problems and look toward the future.
Beautiful. Eddie?
I like what you said, Roger, about repurposing our values, Western values. If by progress we mean only technological progress, economic progress, I don't know. I just spoke to a European recently, a Pole, in fact, and he compared entrepreneurship in Europe versus entrepreneurship in the US. He said there's no comparison. Americans are far more dynamic. They are far more active. Europeans seems to have plateaued or semi-plateaued. So if in those terms, yeah. But if you mean in the broadest sense of progress, just going forward as a civilization, I don't know. We seem to be in a very precarious position right now, where half of the European population worldwide seems to suffer from a kind of self-loathing. They've absorbed this mind virus that we are wicked people because of colonialism, because of this, because of that. And the other half are like, no, 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 the rest of you are crazy. We're fine. We need to stop drilling holes into our own ship so that we sink ourselves. But Rogério, just all right, Roger, you just said repurposing our values going back to medieval times or whatever. And I thought, yes. And that's what has always been evident to me. There are things there. We don't need to reinvent ourselves. We need to rediscover ourselves. It's already there in the pages of these books. It's already there in our impulses. We just have to remember who we are, not be ashamed of who we are, and but be aware of historical crimes, whatever, and don't repeat them. But we already have our individualism. That's one I've spoken with all of you before about individualism. We have to pick up the forgotten tool, the discarded tools of a sense of exploration, a restlessness of the Western spirit. It's already there, but we have forgotten who we are. We've become, I don't know, effeminate, and I mean effeminate in the philosophical sense, as a people who have just stop being vibrant. So we just need to rediscover ourselves. That's my contribution.
Wow. Michael?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of this question, right? Okay, how does, specifically European culture progress, or what is driving European culture toward progress or forward, something like that? I think it's important, or at least when I think about the question, I want to lay out definitions for how I understand or how I think about both of these terms, so culture and progress. Um, so I suppose we'll start with culture, and then I'll take it towards, progress. What does that mean? So the way that I think of culture, what I think about it being, or what its function is, I understand in the context of, well, we use this term a lot, maybe sort of, okay, it's whatever people are kind of doing together in a place, but we kind of, when I say we, I don't necessarily mean the four of us, but I mean what we hear on a regular basis is used as culture, or in this culture war. In culture war, it somehow seems to be like, two political teams, that equals culture war. I'm not, in any case, what the function of culture I understand, and this is heavily informed by a bit of the reading that I've done through Jordan Peterson's work, and also through the Bowling-in tradition of the humanities, which is this institute founded in partnership between Carl Jung and the Mellon Foundation back in the 1930s, which developed, about a 50-year tradition of printing literature and studies at the intersection of the humanities, comparative mythology, comparative religion, psychology, things of this sort. And so, sort of, if I had to give a 2-second definition of how I understand culture to work, is I understand that, okay, we as human beings we have to live in the world, but the world is infinitely complex. Nature is infinitely complex. There's too much information for us to actually deal with, right? There's an infinite amount of complexity. Certainly now, if we can go down, right, even into the quantum realm, or go up to the level of thinking about the expansion of the universe, right? The number of levels of order of magnitude and resolution themselves keep multiplying as we go ahead in sciences. As I understand culture, it is a sort of agreed upon and simultaneously inherited simulation of the natural world. It is our attempt to build a collected psychological dwelling place that maps the cosmos and maps the principles of nature well enough to optimize our survival within nature. And as a population, as a species, maybe even all life, improves its survivability or improves its ability to survive indefinitely or eternally in the forum of in all that is bound by the firmament, so in time and space, by getting that approximation, let's say by harmonizing that cultural model, that configuration, our approximation of nature with nature itself. So the closer we can get our model of nature, which we orient ourselves toward with our behavior, to nature itself, the more adaptable or the better suitable our behavior decisions will be in that realm. And so that's sort of the game, right? That's the challenge as artists, as scientists, as explorers, as right individuals. Jordan Peterson has brought together a lot of research from from evolutionary biology, from behavioral neuroscience, to demonstrate the degree to which this principle of exploration, he talks about explored and unexplored territory. Order and chaos is his sort of archetypal way of putting these two things at sort of in as a coincidence of opposites. The game is to try to make our individual models of the world better harmonize with nature, and then sort of the aggregate of our individual models of nature into a better inheritable package of institutions, of symbols, of things that encode behavioral and value-based information, so that we can, and so that future generations can orient ourselves properly, or as properly as possible, to the eternal patterns of nature for the sake of our continued survival for as long as possible. Okay, that's how I understand the role of culture, or how it functions in human life. Okay, so if I were to think about in that context, what does it mean for culture to progress? I would say that for culture to progress is to narrow that gap, is to get culture to imitate or to harmonize with the principles of nature more closely. And to do that, to get that right, I would say, is the original mission of the sciences. It's also the mission of disciplines surrounding religion, right? Of theology, the idea of practicing a religious life, of a monastic life, the study of systematic theology. These are, okay, said with the express purpose of getting closer to God, but of course, God is the origin and the author of all nature. So it's saying, okay, let's find a single point to aim at, and let's pick the origin, the source from whence time and space itself originate, and the principles that govern all things and action and value within that space. Let's aim at that. And oh, by the way, that happens to be God. And that we should do that is revealed to us by the fact of our existence here on Earth. We have a way to actually be in communication with that. So I would say that historically, the idea of driving closer to God, aiming at God, has been historically something that has driven European culture. That those that harmonization with nature is something that has come as a result of aiming at God within the Christian tradition. I think, and this is something I suppose I'm working through even now as I say it to you. It seems as though in recent centuries we've moved away from that, but even moved away from the idea that we're aiming at something at all, that we need to aim at something at all. There's been this confusion of the very structure of navigating time and space behaviorally. We don't understand. I can certainly say this with respect to students that I've talked to. Eddie, perhaps you might be able to speak to this as well. I've had very basic great books courses and talked about this structure of thinking about your life, or the very, very basic precepts of moral philosophy. Even when I was in graduate school, I don't think I had a very excellent way of articulating this. It wasn't really until I began to study Jordan Peterson's work more deeply that I think I was able to to represent this idea as I'm representing it now. But people have no idea. This is like, there's nowhere that they're being told, like, okay, you have to aim at things, and there are ways that you get to what you're aiming at. And moral philosophy is that discipline of thinking about what you have to do to best arrive at that. But then there are these other disciplines that are aimed at looking at goals stretched out into eternity, beyond just the mundane. You can take these moral philosophical principles, extend them out into infinity, and what you find there is God, or at least many of the faces of God that are presented through Christianity and through Judaism. I'm not as familiar with Eastern traditions, but I understand that this can also be found in many of the classical Eastern traditions as well. You can find this in Plato, right? The idea of the one. So what would I say is driving European culture forward? In popular terms, I would say distraction, something like that. I would say a good portion. Well, I can at least say this from an American perspective. To what degree this is present in Europe, I'm not sure, right? I would say Americans are definitely very interested in distraction. European society maybe having a better quality of life, how to optimize for quality of life, something like that. I think many Americans also optimize for quality of life. Carl Jung kind of had this observation back in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Viktor Frankl definitely in the 1950s, 1960s. That more so Americans, but Europeans as well, sort of were aiming at happiness, and using quality of life as a substitute for happiness, understanding that as sort of a close approximation of happiness. But that in the later half of life, right, Jung was very concerned with treating patients who were facing crisis in the second half of life, as he called it. Frankl in particular noticed this. Both of them came to independent conclusions about the absence of meaning, since pretty good quality of life could be achieved in European and American society, by the age of 40, 45. Most people who pursued a good quality of life, all things considered, right? Maybe not in Eastern Europe, maybe certainly maybe in the 40s or the 30s, not in places that were particularly affected by the Second World War. But if you set your mind to this, in European society and American society, you probably had that good quality of life by your mid 40s. You had your family goals, you had your house, you had your children, you had a good income, you had food on the table, you had leisure time. What else was there to aim at? And sort of there was that disappearance of maybe aiming at something infinite. So I would say historically, just to kind of package this up so we can move on to thinking about some other things here perhaps. Historically, the pursuit or the aiming at the divine and the infinite, I think, was something that was very consciously pursued at the heart of European culture and European cultural institutions. I think in the 19th century, the 20th century, maybe because of the arrival of a new consumerist ethic, maybe because really rapid expansions in quality of life were attainable for many people, that this sort of took over. And I could see, certainly, at least in my experience in the United States, growing up, right, it wasn't even a question. It was like good quality of life, food, housing, whatever, like that's just automatic. You didn't even have to worry about that. You just go through the motions and you're going to have it. That's like, so that's like a quarter of life crisis is like, being 20 or 25. It's just like, all right, I can go get a desk job somewhere and just kind of get a mortgage and sit and wait, and I'll have a house and a family, and that'll be there. Good chance that'll be there. That doesn't even seem like much of a challenge, where people formerly, worked hard in their whole lives to have something like that. Coming at least from the part of the country that I do. Yeah, it was like, all right, well, now this is here automatically. What am I supposed to do at 20 or 25, let alone, the second half of life, as Young would say. So that's sort of my perspective on it. I understand that may not be as thought through some of that, some elements of that while speaking to you now. But does that make sense? Am I totally out of
does.
left field with some of these elements? What do you guys think?
Michael, hold on. I will try to summarize it.
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah. No.
correct me if I was wrong, and you guys can address it, and we will have some free-flowing discussion about it.
Sure.
So, yeah, I really like the moment you say, let's define what a European culture is, and let's define what progress is. And I was like, I could hear it in Jordan's voice, like, what do you mean by culture? What do you mean by progress? And
yes.
let's talk about that. And the idea is that in the past, people were aiming at something, and right now, that aiming at something had been sort of hijacked by the whatever attention-driven, attention-stealing kind of events, right? It's like it became all about grabbing your attention, as opposed aiming towards something. Am I understanding you correctly? So whatever drives the progress today, as opposed to the past, is the attention-grabbing social media, scandalous news, and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I would say, right, under those particular circumstances that you've outlined, I would say progress under those terms is debatable, right? It's distracting, right? What in your sense here of attention grab. It's too frenetic. It's all over the place. It's not focused on a consistent or enduring value. That's part of why I think ancient peoples were so focused.
Divide and conquer, right?
I would say the opposite of divide and conquer, right? I would say that, well,
divided attention.
Okay.
Divided
attention
if your attention
conquered,
is not focused towards the goal, if your attention is completely divided, like it's spread out, over there is my Facebook, over there, it's like these little things. It's like your attention is not focused, let's say, on building a cathedral.
Yes.
You're conquered, like you're manipulated by whoever pulls the strings for your attention, like that.
Yes.
Okay, Rogério and Eddie, jump in.
Sure. I really enjoyed how you addressed one of the main values that culture produces, which is an ontology. Basically, this word means the people's conception of being. What is being? What could we interpret of this world in which we are in, which would make sense? And culture definitely has a big part on that. And I would say that one of the big issues, big problems that is going on today, that only became more visible, more apparent to me, was after I started to kind of gain little by little the ancient person's point of view, and looking back at our current day goings with the ancient person's perspective. It became really painfully clear that pop culture in general is really not your friend, because it's constantly removing your attention without your necessary consent. People are in the age of distraction and the age of digital massified entertainment, all made possible through several technological developments involving broadcast media like radio, television, and the internet, and also more kind of democratized and not so centered forms of media like social media, but and video games as well, also cinema. A huge part of entertainment, as I've seen, is more related to distracting us, degrading our minds, our faculties, or at least not honing them. And if we don't hone our faculties, they're being lost automatically. And almost none of pop culture, entertainment is didactic. Almost no pop culture actually challenges us to become better, gives us an adventure, not just to the protagonist, but gives us a challenge and an adventure to which we can kind of test our mettle in a way that makes us better persons broadly, not just intellectually better, but better in character, better creatively, better regarding emotional self-awareness, self-knowledge, etc. An ancient person, I would say, like Plato, Aristotle, etc., looking at what's going on, they would be aghast by how people are so far removed from their own souls, as they would say, just looking at all these distractions. And so Plato would really smugly point again to his cave allegory, and see how it was at the time probably thought out as a political metaphor, but also an ontological and epistemological metaphor, because people are not kind of relating to the truth. Almost no one has the kind of philosophical, aspirational pursuit in the way they live their lives, as in they are not trying to relate to the truth or whatever the truth might be. As Michael said, hardly people are pointing towards the infinite or the one or the eternal, etc. And that is, in terms of virtue ethics and self-development across life, that's catastrophic, because as Michael highlighted, especially in the second half of life, after the career, family, business, etc., the formal education is behind the individual, it seems like it's the end of the road in a sense, but it's clearly not. If we would look at people like Solon, the legendary leader of Athens, he would say, every day I grow older, but every day I learn something new. And the whole Hellenistic tradition, drawing from Epicurus, Plato, the Stoics, etc., the Cynics, it's really painfully clear that trying to become a better person day by day, bettering your character, using opportunities to do something good as a habit, will make you a better person on the long term. It's good for you. It's good for the culture in which you're immersed, the community in which you're immersed. And this is almost invisible and without expression nowadays.
Eddie?
Yeah, it seems to be a common theme here. God and religion were always central to the European soul for a long time, up until the 20th century, and the great cultural revolutions that upended everything. I guess you could say the French Revolution was the first
Mm,
opening act of this rupture, but
mhm,
it was like a wound in the European soul that was then covered over with scabs, but then the wound reopened again.
mm,
Uh, and it seems that if you remove God, religion, that sense of an ordered supernatural world towards which the human race is ought to direct his or her life, then you leave a vacuum, a void,
mm,
and many things can rush into that vacuum or that void, as we have seen here in the American version. That we are I know it's a stereotype, but we are guilty, as Michael was saying, of a kind of crass materialism, amusing ourselves too much. There's even a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, came out in the
mm,
90s. But I kind of expect that from a young country like us, like Australia, like Canada. But the European manifestation of this void, of the consequences of this void, are startling. I don't see Europeans so much being silly, crass materialists, but more, I don't know, as I said earlier in our talk today, they're the European version of this. I should say the Western European, because Eastern Europeans seem to be on a different wavelength
mm,
now and throughout history. So perhaps I should focus more on the Western European mind, the psyche. I don't know. Many of them, as I said, have decided we no longer take pride in ourselves. On the contrary, we are now enlightened and we see how awful we are. Just like the
mm,
radicals in the French Revolution thought, we are now enlightened and we see how awful the nobles and the clergy are, and they deserve death, chop off their heads. And they reached a very radical conclusion. Today's radicals in Western Europe seem to decide that because we're such an awful people, we either don't deserve to exist or we don't deserve to have the the beauty, to go back to beauty, of our
mm,
culture transmitted. It stops with us. We're going to make things as un-European as possible because anything that bears the stamp of Europe is necessarily bad. So again, I don't want to venture into angry politics here, but let's change the demographics of Europe. And that's a dog whistle. We all know what I'm talking about here.
mm,
So
mm.
I think that's my take on that. Many Europeans have just decided we don't want to be part of this club anymore. We agree with what our critics have said about us being awful, and we agree with them. And you're not going to convince me, and we're going to throw away our flags. And whoops, sorry, I'm knocking stuff down. We're just going to go into some strange new nihilistic version of ourselves.
Mm,
And I
mm.
know I'm not. I don't know where we go from here.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's particularly valuable, Eddie, that you call attention to this question of that you point back to the French Revolution. There's an element of that I want to take a second to talk about before I get back to Rogério speaking about ontology, which I think is also significant in some things that I've noticed going on in our contemporary world. Um, I've often sort of thought to myself that Europeans and Americans alike in Western civilization, we haven't yet made sense of the 19th century. I don't think we've fully come to terms with the 19th century. A lot of problems, it seems to me, that we're still experiencing in the 21st century now are 19th century problems that we didn't deal with, but
Mm,
that exploded in society's face with the World Wars and then the Cold War. That those were crazy emergencies that needed to be dealt with in the 20th century. They were consequences, all of them, of the 19th century, but they were immediate crises that had to be dealt with that, you know, people who hadn't oriented themselves to 19th century problems dealt with them, right? Whoever, we survived the First World War as a species. We survived the Second World War. We survived the Cold War. And that was some almost 80 years of, okay, we're dealing with this global military conflict, the clash of nations, immediately followed by the rise of the Soviet Union, immediately followed by the Second World War and the rise of fascism and National Socialism, immediately followed by the conquest of almost all of Asia by communism, immediately followed by trying to figure out how this war would be waged without it triggering nuclear annihilation. To the Soviet Union fell. Okay, hey, the emergency is over in 1991,
Yeah.
at least for the West. Wait a second, how did we get here again? Like, too many people have died who had any sense of being able to say, okay, how did we get here? It was how many next generations of people just inherited, like, crisis, deal with it, see ya. Like, to what degree? That's what a lot of the 20th century seems like to me. And a token few, or a precious few people have been able to go back and say, hey, what about this stuff in the 19th century? Hey, what about that whole Paris Commune deal in 1870? Hey, what about, like, the conquest of Rome by the Italian kingdom that, tried to exile the Pope and just, like, became extremely voraciously violent against the Catholic Church. It's like, okay, maybe there were these conflicts. Maybe the Catholic Church, indeed, in the 18th century, had overreached. But what was really going on in this period? Did we really settle that? Did we really figure things out? Was the Prussian version of nationalism that was born by the 19th century Humboldtian school system that still underpins public education in the West? Like, we didn't deal with that problem. And now it's like it's being harnessed toward a purpose that seems to be furthering this kind of unraveling of the cultural foundations of what came before. So I think it's very apt of you to point to the French Revolution and say, like, okay, that's this first major, explosion of, hey, do we just dig everything up, and can we make everything, out of reason? Can we just reason our way into a perfect society? Or let's just try it. Let's just go for it, because, like, reason's great. Let's do it. Um, so I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot we could get out there, and I think it's very good you point to that. But then to come to Rogerio's point too here about ontology and this concern with ontology. I would say that, I think that there, at least in the U.S., I've been particularly keen to look at the two kind of, the how would you say, the various pieces, the various aspects of the de facto political philosophies, if you even want to call them political philosophies. I would call, maybe oikumene is a better word to talk about whatever it is, the philosophies that govern our political parties and their sort of media constellations of ideas. They're not even really coherent. You know, to say, like, oh, I'm a Democrat. What does that mean that you stand for? Or to say that you're liberal. To say you're liberal in the United States just means you follow the Democratic Party. That doesn't necessarily make you a liberal. For example, Democrats were among the most conservative people when it came to the question of the vaccine, and Republicans, called conservatives, were among the most liberal. Now, that's not to say, this is right, that's wrong, but it's to say that these terms, conservative and liberal, don't actually track to the behaviors themselves or to the viewpoints themselves on a lot of the issues. The parties and their adherents and the media flip-flops back and forth on whatever particular issue just because, the other party took a standpoint first that was the opposite. So, but this question of ontology, or sort of the de facto embodied sense of being that each of these broad strokes of major cultural philosophies in the United States, that, interestingly, again, to track back to Peterson and some of the research of his graduate students have pointed out, have these kind of archetypal personality dimensions to them. It seems to me that there are several elements of a fully fleshed out ontology that are missing, actually, from the mainstream depiction of each sort of, let's call it, political ideology in the US. So I would say that a fully fleshed out ontology has three parts, or at least this is how I've been able to in my own sort of thinking and writing, I've come to it. I would say it has, what would you call it, a nominal being, a functional being, and a purposive being. I don't know what you would call it, but it's something like something is in one sense how you call it. It is in a certain sense how you use it, and it is in a certain sense what it is intended for. So I think I've come up with this hammer example in the best book.
Teleological being, perhaps
Yes, yes.
teleological.
Yeah, I don't know if you would call it like a telotic being. My Greek's not good enough to be able to derive a particular the right configuration of the word telos in that sense. But yes, I'm sure I don't know the Greek tradition, the Greek philosophical tradition well enough. You probably would be able to frame that appropriately better than I would, Rogério. But in any sense, right? You can say something is whatever you call it. And that seems to be right now what the left or quote unquote liberals or the Democrats seem to say as the prime element of being in the United States. Things are what you call it, what you call them, right? A woman is a woman because you call it a woman. A human being is cat gender because you say it is, right? It's like the name is the primary determinant of being, not the makeup of the body, not actions, not aims. It is what the word has primacy in determinant being. And of course, this is something taken out of my understanding, out of the postmodern philosophies of Derrida and Jean-Paul Sartre and Foucault and such, the late 19th century French postmodern school. That sort of that's the argument there. I would say that then the other major philosophy, although it tends to be more mixed, it's a lot less radically determinant on one. I would say that at least in the critique of the left, I would say that in the so-called right or conservative philosophy, there can be, I don't know if this is prime now, but there is a functional definition of being. Things are as they do. I think that's a much more verisimilitudinous or a type of being that harmonizes better with nature. To say a functional being is a better primary determinant of being. But I think in both cases there tends to be this absence of let's say teleological being in Rogério's sense, or this sort of purpose-based being in the sense that, yes, a hammer may be a hammer because you call it a hammer. A hammer may be a hammer because you use it as a hammer. But the truest hammer, that hammer that is the most hammer, that is at the center of the category of hammer, upon which all other accidental notions of hammer converge, is the hammer that is designed to be a hammer. Something like that. I mean, all of these have relationships to one another, but that element is also important. And I think that tends to be right, sort of getting back to this idea that sort of a sense of what are we aiming at, what are we striving for, tends to be absent in our embodied ontologies. At least I could say in most people I talk to, their experience of the world or how they comport their lives tends to be absent this particular element of an embodied ontology. Does that make sense? Does that shake out?
It makes sense, although like the notion of free will came to mind. Like imagine a hammer that has a free will. Like how does that complicate things? A hammer is a hammer because it was designed to be a hammer and its function is to be a hammer. And then imagine a hammer with consciousness that he is like, I'm a butterfly. It's like, bro, you're not a butterfly, you are a hammer. You are designed to be a hammer. And the hammer is like, no, I'm a butterfly. And by the way, like I have free will, but free will cannot surpass the matter of things.
Yes.
Naming things like this sort of superficial. I want to be named a butterfly, even though I am a hammer.
Yes.
And then, like, does it make you feel better that you're a hammer called a butterfly? I think humanity is at the moment in this sort of rebellious stage where we're like, we want to change who we are, but like, let's start with changing how we call ourselves, let's say.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
not the entire humanity, but I do see more and
Yeah.
more of it happening at the moment. Speaking of Olympics. Yeah, Eddie.
It seems like
Well-
we forgot our past so much that we became a teenager again as a humanity.
Yeah.
Because, well, there's this rebellious spirit, as you've mentioned, since the French Revolution for sure. There's moral relativism, there's an epistemological crisis. People in this postmodern scene hardly can agree on almost anything in absolute terms. So this is a really bad situation, problematic situation for people to find common ground, which I think is sorely needed for people from the entire Abrahamic tradition to get along, whether they are Christian from whatever denomination, Jewish and Islamic, and going further for other to get along with other traditions as well. I would say that we really need to find things that no one can disagree with. Like, for instance, hardly anyone identifies as immortal. Is that right? And get away with it. This is something that even Roman emperors would have slaves reminding them, even after huge military victories. So memento mori, remember that you are immortal, remember that you're not a god. And if we forget that while we are entertained with all this eye candy of pop culture, we might forget that we are mortals, that we are here for a very, very limited amount of time. We might play being a butterfly and miss the main show, so to speak, and kind of mislive. And this is something that individually I'm trying not to do. I'm trying to live a life of meaning, purpose, in which I leave something behind that helps others, regardless of people even remembering me. So fame, what is fame after you're dead? It's nothing. And so, yeah, I think we need to recover some of this groundwork of common ground that we can get from ancient and centuries ago traditions that has kind of been uprooted, as we've been discussing here, by these turmoils and upheavals of culture, that we must be very, very wary of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, which I think has been occurring to a great extent.
I want to hear from Eddie. The idea of your book is education and reminding people of the ancient civilization through educating them on it, even through the book. Like, I want to hear you on the subject.
Well, I think both Michael and Roger have almost said everything I wanted to say. We're going through this cataclysm. Oh, one thing that I did want to address was, I'm not sure when it started in the West, but it seems like as if a seed was planted of some demon seed that gave birth to a demon vine. And that vine has grown, intertwined itself with the Western vine or tree or whatever. And it's gotten stronger and stronger. And the first evidence of this demon seed was the French Revolution. And later came Marxism, and then came the tribulations of the 20th century. Now we're in this wokeism. And it for me, it suggests that some cultural trend exists in the West and has existed for several centuries that is actively working against the West itself. And every once in a while, this serpent whispers something into the ear of the Westerns and says, hey, kid, come here. Let me tell you about this thing called Marxism. Let me tell you about this thing called Bolshevism. Let me tell you about this thing called moral relativism. And it makes me wonder, are these accidents of history? Or is there a common thread we can point to and say, oh, I see. That's where it comes from. And I've looked into this, and it's led me down several rabbit holes, and I won't discuss all of them here, but I don't see this in other cultures. I don't see. I'm not that well versed in non-Western cultures, but I don't see the Chinese or the Arabs or the Latin Americans struggling every few generations with a new reconfiguration of who they are and what their meaning in the universe is the way we do. And maybe some of that may be an effect of this stubborn individualism, this idea to split the atom over and over, to turn over every rock and say what's under this rock, what's under this rock. But this seems something different. It's like a negative spirit. This thing that hovers around us that doesn't want to see us succeed. And without getting too mystical or religious, I wonder if there's something there, if it's a spirit or if it's connected to a certain population that feels resentment or hostility. I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there. Why do we keep trying to sabotage ourselves?
Well, if I could offer a few, just what immediately came to mind on those remarks, Eddie. This Kara, Rogério and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, maybe back in January, but the idea of I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist and his sort of hemisphere hypothesis. There are two books in particular he's written in the past 20 years that are that I mean, it's his take on this particular question you have, right? I don't know to what degree it fully answers the question, but it's an interesting hypothesis to have in one's toolbox. I would say it's a pretty powerful perspective. I would say, at least in my capacity, it's combined with some other things. It harmonizes with some of Jordan Peterson's observations as well, and it's this idea that our existence as or our brain structure as having two separate hemispheres gives us the ability to approach the world or to channel our attention through two principal sort of frameworks or through two principal modes, and that each hemisphere brings the world into being through its attention in a different sort of mode, and that the right hemispheric perception or perspective, I should say, its mode of attention tends to be holistic, synthesizing, viewing the big picture. It's lower resolution, but it sees everything together. It makes connections. It's able to put things into context. It always sees things in context. Maybe to order things properly, not so much, but understanding one's place in a greater design and a bigger picture is something that comes out of the right hemispheric perspective, its motive of engaging attention, at least per McGilchrist. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, is less concerned with comprehending the world as it is with apprehending the world, that is, putting the world to use, making it into a tool. And its attention is very focused, it's very high resolution, but it's narrow. It blocks out context, it takes things out of context, it abstracts, cuts things off. It's responsible for analysis. It's also where our language apprehension comes from, is localized to the left hemisphere. And so basically his hypothesis is that, okay, a proper way to approach the world with one's attention is to have this alternation between these two hemispheres with a healthy amount of asymmetry toward the right. And this comes from his observation that right hemispheric lesions, right, impairments to the right hemisphere, far decrease an individual's ability to function properly in the world than damage to the left hemisphere. So he looks at a ton of different cases of people who have suffered right and left hemispheric lesions or damage. Right hemispheric damage, which means overly dominant left hemispheric individuals, are completely unaware that anything is wrong. They constantly confabulate that everything is completely normal, and yet they essentially walk through the world blind, eclectically. They make up stories about what they're doing. They have no idea it's clearly have no idea where they're going, but they pretend as though they're completely fine and everything's fine. Yeah, if you ask them about it, like they'll even they'll even tell you, for example, that their right hand isn't, or their left hand, because it's crossed, their left hand isn't their left hand. And they wish someone would cut it off because they don't even know where it came from. Maybe it's their mom's hand. They don't know. They don't know who put it there. Really bizarre stuff. Whereas people with left hemispheric lesions, although they have a harder time using tools or interacting with the world, they have this thing where they can't quite find the word they're looking for, but they can kind of talk around it. It's very frustrating to them, but they're aware of what's been lost. And they're usually in a decent position to ask other people to help them with what they can't quite seem to get. And so they don't, they can survive in the world. Maybe they don't thrive in the way that they could if they had both hemispheres intact, but that's sort of less of an issue for them. What he suggests is that the way that we've configured modern culture, this maybe obsession with putting the world to an apprehensive use, right? Or I shouldn't say apprehensive use, but to apprehension, to a use, a focus, and too big of a focus on exploiting the world to our own individual purposes. The degree to which we've become sort of sagittal plane, I've heard this elsewhere, right? Sort of sagittal plane people who we just focus narrowly on our screens, and we're so wrapped up in a world of words that this configuration of things may be really critically pushing us toward a pathological asymmetry. I mean, that's right. That's part of his perspective there. And I don't know. That's a good question. That's made me think. Say historically, I wonder, has there been, if we look historically at Western culture for these sort of demon seeds, or this vine you're talking about, the seeds of what Marxism or Jacobinism or moral relativism or this type of thing you're speaking about. I think you're absolutely right to say, like, oh, hey, this doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? Where exactly, what did we work into our culture that potentially started or at least on the periphery of our culture, that started to kind of grow into, or reach kind of veins or tendrils or something, like a sort of foot fungus or something like that, into the culture as a kind of parasitic outgrowth, something like that. Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe that's something we can think about.
Yeah.
I would say that maybe it's a pattern, just like Aristotle likes to say in his Poetics, that although history will report on events with varying degrees of accuracy, if we can capture the patterns of history in poetry, then these patterns are so much more valuable, because they encapsulate what is basically human nature interacting with natural nature with time going forward. And if we look at Thucydides' report of the Peloponnesian War, we can see some of the patterns that happened in the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, with the uprising of the helots in Sparta, and democratic or liberal anti-aristocracy movements springing about with the turmoil. And so I would say that the demon per se of human history is when hardship happens and we are quote blindsided. We aren't like Stoic sages or Brahmanic yogi masters who can just brush it off and deal with it. People panic, and when people panic, they grab the shiniest thing that they have, and sometimes it turns out that the shiniest thing people have is fanatical hatred towards the haves, because you are a have-not. Other times it is just how how do you say it, scapegoating a different culture that happens to be there, like what happened in the aftermath after the First World War in Germany, when people were scapegoating the Jewish population. And if they lie, they repeat these lies sufficiently and use tried techniques of neuromarketing, they can kind of prime populations for violence, basically, for hatred and violence and turmoil, which becomes a vicious cycle. And if we look at different epochs of history, also in China with the Warring States period, we could see a lot of heritage being lost. Also the Great Leap Forward, when Mao was just eradicating Chinese heritage there as well. We see a lot of fanaticism. This is also caricatured in the Dune saga with the Butlerian movement, that they are a fanatical anti-technology movement, and they commit atrocities, huge atrocities, killing huge amounts of people, just because someone reported on them using forbidden technology. Well, again, it's a pattern that's seen in history that has been rendered in science fiction or a fictional account, that I think we need to be aware of this kind of pattern and be prepared to it with whatever mental technology we can we can acquire. And some of these mental technologies come from Stoicism, some from Buddhism, some from Vedanta, some from Taoism. But I would say we shouldn't spare expenses like the guy from Jurassic Park, Hammond, at acquiring a means to deal with turmoil, to deal with hardship in a positive way, in a way that we can even repurpose hardship into fuel to propel the growth of individual humans and humanity as a whole, because these kinds of waves will continue to happen, and we can deal with them, receive them in a very nasty and unhealthy way, or we can figure out a way to kind of ethically crest the wave, so to speak, without adding to the atrocity, even ameliorating or minimizing atrocities.
Wow, thank you everyone. Rogério, Eddie, Michael, that was really educational for me. I am looking forward to part 2 of today's discussion, which will come within the next few weeks. Please check out YouTube channels of my guests and Eddie's book as well. All the links are below. Thank you, and see you in the next Food for Thought. Bye.
Thank you, Kara.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Kara.
Was it a hammer that dreamt to be a butterfly, or was it a butterfly that dreamt it was a hammer? What's your favorite note to self?
Okay, so it would be something along the lines, I could only paraphrase, as we should be suspicious of looking at pain and hardship in a repulsive way. We should also look at them with the skepticism of not being hasty at judging these hardships and pain and suffering as something that we want to eliminate completely from our lives. We must also find ways to embrace our hardships, learn from them, and if we can do that, we can become better through our hardships.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. Guys, what did you think about that?